Hi, everyone. This is Ryan Lewis, and this is the second of our three-part series with Azavea. Back in the studio with me today, I have Rob Emanuele and Joe Morrison. Welcome back, guys.
Welcome.
It's good to be back.
Right, and if you've listened to this podcast at all, or just even read the descriptions, and you're not a person that is very familiar with machine learning or geospatial analytics or data analysis writ large, you may have asked yourself, what are these people talking about? Do these words even mean anything? And you're asking, well, when can I get involved in this podcast? Fear not. Fear not, friends across the internet. Today we are changing a little bit of our normal discourse to focus more on the business aspects. What drives work in this sector? And I think specifically what we're going to be really diving into is how can businesses be structured around really open source software. This is something that is essential to the geospatial market, certainly something that we at Cosmic have supported since our founding. And if you look more broadly, just across the tech market in general, 2019 really could be argued as the year of open source, both from the success of a variety of companies, as well as a lot of the discussions going on with some of the big mergers and acquisitions right now. And so we see all this and we absorb it and we think, well, this is just the way it is. But I remember kind of when I was first coming up, really the only exemplar at that time was Red Hat, and people kind of looked at Red Hat and said, well, that's a one-off. We're not going to see that again. That's not replicable. That can't be replicated. And so I think it's kind of important with Azavea here today to talk about, how did you guys get started? So much of your work and your product suite is built around open source, and you've had a lot of success with that. And so I think there's just a lot of questions we can dive in from the business perspective. And so just to kind of get started, and for those of you who, for the listeners who perhaps aren't as familiar with you guys, why don't you just walk us through just kind of like your product suite and just the range of things you do across the open source community, and maybe how you got there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I kind of came at this from the same background that you did, where I thought, why? So when I first joined Azavea like 5 years ago, I was totally confused by the whole open source thing. So I was like, why are we just giving this stuff away?
Yeah, what's wrong with these people? Rob doesn't know anything.
Yeah, and really, I still wonder that.
That Rob knows things?
Yeah, about Rob specifically.
Okay,
like, how has he faked it this long? It's an incredible run, but as I spent more time around the software engineers at Azavea that are so impressive and so passionate and so creative, I started to kind of get it more or less what we're doing around open source. And so your question was about our product offering and kind of what we do as a business. Our core business, I would say 80 to 90% of our business is building custom software applications for people. And we focus on software applications that have a geospatial bent. That's just because geospatial data is abundant and it's growing at a greater pace than ever.
And it's better than anything else that anyone else could do.
Right.
That's just a fact.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, geospatial, what could be a higher pursuit? I can't even imagine. But it's crappy data. Like, it is just very difficult to work with and requires kind of a cross-disciplinary approach to be able to work with it. You can't just be like a run-of-the-mill web developer. You have to care enough to learn how to open QGIS and learn about coordinate systems and learn about what it takes to map things to a three-dimensional sphere that we call Earth. It's kind of a intellectually stimulating field. So most of what we do is just building custom applications for people that don't want to have to worry about any of that junk. They just want to worry about the problem they're trying to solve. That remaining 20%, 10 to 20%, some of it is data analytics. So we have a data analytics team that will take your data, munge it, clean it up, draw insights out of it. And then that other 10% is really research and development, which for the most part recently has been focused on applying deep learning methods to geospatial data. But prior to that and continuing today, just processing it in general, whether it's applying machine learning methods or other analytical methods. So that's like the services part of our business is the brunt of our business. However, we have started to build tools over the last 3 years. I've been working on one called Raster Foundry for 3 years and a few months, where we have tried to build an open source replicable engine for munging large volumes of geospatial imagery. So it's really, I think of it like the backbone or like the foundation of just being able to take a large catalog of imagery, visualize it, move it from one place to another. And then Rob's work has led up actually building tools around drawing insights out of that imagery. And so that's what I think of as our product offering is Raster Foundry and the associated open source libraries around it. We will take that product, I put that in quotes because every time it actually gets implemented and people find value in it, we're building a lot of custom tooling around it. But it kind of gives us a template or a head start on building applications for people with this common tooling.
What was the motivation for putting something like Raster Foundry out on open source?
I would love to hear your explanation for this,
Rob. Well, we've sort of operated as a company in an open first type setting. So, and that hasn't always been the case. We've been around since 2001 as a consulting company, and we were sort of an Esri shop, an Esri business partner, and we're working with Microsoft tooling and C#, et cetera. And we have a program at Azavea called the 10% Time Program, where 10% of employees' time could be spent towards researching a topic that they're interested in. And so somebody, I'm not sure of the date, it was before my time, was like, there's this thing called PostGIS, there's this open source community, there's this thing called OSGeo. I want to look into the tooling and see, if that might be some, a direction we want to take the company. So there were a couple, there was a research project, and that turned into a couple client projects relying on open source technology, to the point where we're like, we're always using open source and relying on the amazing tools that people have put out into the open source world. We had some tooling internally to deal with raster data and process raster data at sort of web speed, so request response cycles, be able to do things like weighted overlays on raster data. And we decided to turn that into a library, which is now GeoTrellis. And so that was put out under an open source license. It was a dual license GPL and commercial, which, our hypothesis then was, people will use the GPL and then they'll actually buy it, purchase it if they want to use it commercially. That didn't really work out. We ended up moving it to Apache 2, and the community, the open source community around it since then has sort of flourished. So
thank you for that. I was early in on GeoTrellis, so
awesome.
I'm bummed I don't have like some sort of sticker or something. Like I was there the first year.
You can always just fall back on knowing that you were there.
Yeah.
No one can take that from you.
It's only for me. Got it.
So at that point, because we were drawing so much from the open source community, and then another angle of it is, we're a B corporation, we're mission driven. So our mission is to advance the state of the art in geospatial technology and apply it for civic, social, and environmental impact. So we try to take on projects that have some sort of impact element, but we're also trying to advance the state of the art. So as part of our mission, like putting code out there and contributing back to the open source community is like really core to our values. So we're sort of, we took on this open first mentality. So, when we won some SBIR grants from Department of Energy and NASA to develop Raster Foundry, it was sort of like the default choice. Like, let's start with this in the open. That's sort of the reasoning and the context behind why we started.
Jury's out on whether or not that was the right decision, but we can talk about that later, I guess.
Yeah, and actually, to kind of just jump right in on that, I know one of the things that we hear a lot in the course of our work is that the community, air quotes community, is great at not necessarily building, but at least identifying sort of what's the state of the art, and then from that, you can have your whole software engineering life cycle, right, that can optimize that and then figure out how to develop it and deploy it and then have that be repeatable, right? And so that's the argument as it goes. To extend kind of on your comment there, Joe, is that what you're seeing so far based on your experiences? It doesn't just have to be Raster Foundry. Obviously, GeoTrellis was, for those of you who aren't super familiar, that was a big thing inside the community not that long ago. And so you have a lot of examples you can pull on. I'm curious if you've seen sort of the community or your open source contributions really help drive where you think the product needs to go.
Yeah, I would say we talk sometimes internally about how do you measure the success of an open source project that we're either contributing to or maintaining ourselves. It's really difficult because from our perspective, an open source project could be a huge success for reasons that are totally unrelated to the community around it. And so one example of that would be like Raster Foundry, where to our knowledge, there are only a few organizations that use Raster Foundry besides us. So by a typical benchmark, that would not be a successful open source project. Like, we're responsible for 99% of the code commits to Raster Foundry, and therefore it's not really been adopted by a broader community. However, being able to point to that code as a reference code, being able to kind of show instead of tell people what we're working on has been a huge boon from a marketing and sort of business development perspective, to say, like, look, we're not just lying about what we're capable of. If you really want to get under the hood, go to this repo, pull it down, set it up yourself. And that's actually happened at several large organizations where really talented engineers have set up Raster Foundry on their own and done the proof of concept without even needing us.
So it's a way to prove like your bona fides before you even walk in the room.
Totally. That's not necessarily a great open source project through another lens, though. And that other lens would say, like, advancing the state of the art in geospatial science really requires adoption, especially from people that wouldn't otherwise have access to that type of capability. And so that's why I think projects like GeoTrellis, which is really at this point a set of libraries, a set of tools, and Raster Vision, which may eventually mature into a set of libraries, but for now is really one repository. Those have far more stars on GitHub, whatever that matters to you. They have people submitting pull requests outside of Azavea. There's actually companies that have built their company in part on top of those libraries, which is kind of exciting to see, because we don't really see it as like a small pie that we have to like get as much of. We think most of the opportunity in the geospatial world hasn't been realized yet. So the more companies that are promoting solutions, especially if they're tied back to our technology under the hood, that's good for us. So I would say that it's a bit of a mixed bag when we're trying to evaluate what we open source. And I think in recent years, we've open sourced far less than we have in the past. We've sort of changed our opinion from that default open to, if you're going to open source something, A, be willing to commit the resources to maintain it indefinitely and to build the community around it, and B, have a really specific goal in mind and a story for how people can adopt it. Because it doesn't matter how valuable or useful that tool is. If people don't understand why it would be valuable to them and how to get started using it, they won't adopt it. So I think you've seen a bit of a maturing of our strategy around open source over time, just related to, frankly, I wouldn't call them failures from our perspective because they were useful, but Raster Foundry, OpenTreeMap's another one we've built. I mean, if you go to our GitHub profile, Azavea, there's probably over 100 repos there. Not all of them are super popular, like knock it out of the park hits. And we try to learn from those and change how we're stewarding open source projects that we release now and into the future.
Do you think some of this is just your desire to move more and more into the open source side? Do you think some of that is just a product of working in the geospatial industry? I mean, we talked about this on a previous pod, but none of us started in geospatial, and I know for me, I was really stunned when I first started working in this domain, just how much resources were available and almost more of how it was culturally expected. I mean, I was just looking back, like GDAL goes back to early 2000s, like right before you guys were founded. And it would be weird in some circumstances to do what we do and not contribute in some way. Like, I don't want to say we'd be ostracized. I already am, but that's for different reasons.
Yeah.
That's just because no one wants to talk to me. But that's a whole nother topic. But was that maybe the motivation, just as you got more into it and people were started saying, hey, like, why don't you, help out in these different efforts? Or
yeah, I do think there's like a almost odd cultural norm around open source, and yeah, GDAL is like a huge part of that, because you don't really do anything with raster data. Like, Google doesn't do anything with raster data without using GDAL, right? Like, it is just such a baseline fundamental tool that the first time you enter into the space, you trip on it. Like, it's right there. So because it's such a fundamental tool, and there's so many tools like that out there, yeah, you're sort of introduced into a culture where it is sort of expected, right? And if you're not doing that, then you're sort of like on the outside looking in, right? And then so organizations like Mapbox that were just like, we're also committed to taking our internal libraries and putting it out there to allow the development culture of geospatial to to really take off and to be able to put out open specs and everything. So you see sort of traditionally proprietary organizations like ESRI that are now like, okay, we want to participate in the open source. That people are kind of chasing that sort of participation, and I think you see that in other fields. But yeah, as I take a look at other industries, it's kind of remarkable around geospatial, like how specific it is, like how much open source and really really good open source code there is.
So what does that mean for you guys, just in the near term, as you have more of sort of the larger incumbent players stepping into this market, trying to figure out what their contribution is, whether they're creating their own repositories or contributing to something? How does that factor into your strategy as you guys are, you have your R&D work that you're thinking about deploying in, you have some of your custom projects that maybe will inform some of your other repos. How does is that something that's even on your radar right now, or is it just something to think about but not really react to?
Yeah, I think about that a lot, because if you're running a company that relies on software engineers right now, then if you're really attracting the best software engineers, you have to be realistic that, Rob could leave Azavea to work for Google for, $400,000 a year or whatever, and live in, wherever he wanted to. And
I thought we established Rob didn't know what he was doing.
Yeah.
Someone like Rob.
Make up your mind.
Someone like Rob, but
do we need to
very
take a break, Joe?
confident.
All
Yeah,
right.
someone like Rob, but extremely confident and well-spoken and handsome, could go and work for Google.
Shots fired.
The point I'm making is that you can't, and really it ties into what you just said, Rob. You can't fake the clout you get from open source contributions. There are folk heroes in the geospatial open source community, like Chris Holmes, like Frank Warmerdam of GDAL, like Bori Park at PostGIS. There are these people that are like mortals that live among us but are famous. Lossy Rob, that's Rob's handle. Like, you're known for your contributions to GeoTrellis. Louis Fishgold at Azavea is known for his contributions to Raster Vision. The authenticity that comes along with those contributions, it's a way to compete for talent and retain talent when otherwise you would never be able to afford those people's talents, because they're motivated by something beyond just a salary. And if you're not offering them the ability to contribute to an open source project, certain engineers are not going to go work for you, because they could work for themselves, or they could go work for a tech giant for 3, 4, 5 times the pay that you can afford. And so when I see those incumbents, those big companies moving into the space, I'm happy, because I think, all right, there's more open source code, there's more capability that's going to be built for people. But I'm also looking at literally the GitHub handles of the people that are contributing, because I'm thinking, is that somebody that I'm going to work with in the future? Because you build a reputation. There are certain firms in geospatial, Mapbox, Cardo, even the biggest ones that have taken on venture capital have a genuine commitment to open source software, and they have a community of engineers that are respected by other companies. You build that up over time, you hang on to that reputation. It's not something you can fake or bootstrap overnight. And so I think if you're a big company and you're not thinking about open source, just from a pure talent strategy,
It's not part of the conversation.
Yeah, you're going to lose your best people to smaller companies, or just they're going to go work for themselves.
And I completely agree with you on particularly the sort of the folk legends aspect. I'm kind of joking when I say this, kind of not, that there really should be like a Mount Rushmore. Like either I love shirts. Anyone who's listening to this podcast knows I know them. We can do shirts, stickers. I think that's a project we should undertake. In a little more serious nature, though, I know when I was first starting working with GeoTrellis, it's actually really cool to sit with you, Rob, on a podcast, because I remember for a long time I was like, who is this guy?
Who is Lossy Rob?
Because we would just accept whatever you and for for me and just some of my other work with Chris Holmes, we'd accept whatever was produced, and and Paul Ramsey's another one, and I just assume that I hope whatever's being committed is good because I'm going to accept it as such. And so that's absolutely true. I think, though, it kind of leads to the question, though, as you build up sort of these reputations, and then you also have sort of these different projects, right, that have momentum. So, right, GeoChellist grew and changed over time. How does your strategy thinking evolve around that? So as you guys now, you've had Raster Foundry came out. It's been gaining some traction. How does your thinking evolve? Like, do you say, all right, if it doesn't get momentum at some point, like, do we maybe change the track? Or if it suddenly gets hot, do we start putting more resources in? How does your thinking go? Because your labor, right, even is still tied to something. So you still have to, people only have so many hours in a day, figuring out where to balance their time in terms of committing updates to a particular library over another one. That's got to weigh on you guys, particularly as you expand the amount of projects you're supporting.
Yeah, for sure. It's tough. Especially in like GeoChellist's case, which there's now a community of users that have use cases that have informed like where the library should go, but also might diverge from like our internal use cases, right? How do we balance our commitment to supporting this like large ecosystem of code with features that users are craving, with internal needs and internal deadlines and all those things? How do we balance, putting out a project that might not gain that traction, because it's not necessarily like a foundational scoped library, something like Raster Foundry, and then somebody makes a pull request or somebody puts up issues, and it's like, okay, well, this, what is the value of sort of maintaining this open source code base that is not necessarily gaining that type of traction, or maybe you shouldn't be trying to use it for X, Y, and Z. I think it's sort of case by case basis, and we try to make sure that our first commitment is our clients, but we kind of treat the open source community, especially the GeoTrails foundational years, we treated the open source community as clients, and as long as it wasn't totally out of left field, it did help direct the project, or what we wanted to do with the project. Because a lot of the times, what the community was bringing, it's like, oh, I didn't think of that. Like, actually, I need to take that into account, so that if the library can't go in that direction, is that eventually going to be a direction that Azavea is going to want that capability in our future? Yes. So now, by satisfying the community needs, you're like kind of satisfying your future needs. So yeah, it's sort of a tough balance, and you have to weigh client deadlines with putting resources into being good open source maintainers, which is also really, really important, and a lesson that we learn as far as if you're going to put open source out there and you're going to ask people to use it, you sort of have an obligation to respond and say, okay, this was broken. Let's fix it in this direction, or at least say like that's not the direction we're taking this project. If you want to fork it, that's fine. But yeah, it's a tough balance.
Yeah, and it's always surprising how much labor it takes just even for just a small amount of responses. And I know that's something that we've marched through in some of our libraries as well. And I can always tell when Nick Weir is a data scientist on our team. I can always tell when he's been going too long, because he just starts grumbling to himself.
He just starts crying at his desk.
It's like, Nick, just take a walk. Just get a good cup of coffee that's a pour over, that's artisanal. Only artisanal. No Dunkin' Donuts. And come on back. You'll be okay.
Yeah. I mean, to your question, how do we balance this too? Definitely there's an element of it that's like you're serving multiple masters, so to speak. So you've got the open source community, and that's weighing on people's time and their energy. And then you've got client deadlines like Rob was talking about. We know to the hour what percentage of everyone's time needs to be billed to client work in order for us to keep the lights on every month, every quarter, every year. And we track that closely. The reason that Azavea puts out so much open source work is that we take that out of time we could build to be more profitable. Like, we're literally a less profitable company because of the open source work that we produce. And yet we have to be profitable over the long term in order to remain an entity, because we've never taken on funding from anyone else. So we have to balance that. And it means that we're playing with a short stack. So we're like, I think of it, it's like we're at the poker table, we're taking bets on open source projects. We can't play optimally because we have a shorter stack than other people at the table. And so it's not perfect, but it is sustainable, which we're very proud of. I think I would bet my left leg that Mapbox, which is one of the best open source contributors in geospatial ever, I bet they're not profitable, and I bet it's not something that they worry about as much as they worry about growing. And if you want to grow, open source is a great way to get to a bigger audience. Like it's an effective strategy. What I think is so interesting is that there are so many ways to build a business around open source software. It works for a small, profitable professional services firm in Azavea. It works for a venture-backed product firm and someone like Mapbox. It works for a weird hybrid services firm like you mentioned Red Hat. And so there's all sorts of examples of companies IPOing recently, like MongoDB may have IPO'd a while back. Maybe not. I may be confusing them with Elastic, maybe, that has an open source component to what they do.
We need a fact check on this from the producer team. Wait, they're not paying attention. Never mind.
There are seemingly more and more companies that have an open source core to what they do. Mesosphere, and there's a bunch. Hortonworks around like Scala. They're all like, I remember Googling for this when I was confused. Like, oh, there must be some definitive like how to build a business around open source software piece that someone's written somewhere. It doesn't exist to my knowledge. It's very much in flux and being figured out. I keep coming back to the talent thing, because why do all these companies with very different perspectives and hypotheses about why open source is important, why do they all seem to outlast companies that pop up all the time with the next proprietary platform that's going to be the platform everybody uses? I think it's because they wind up with the best minds that are working on their stuff instead of the proprietary platform. So yeah, I think it's something that we will sacrifice short-term profitability as a company in order to keep the doors open for the next 10 years, because we have a mission that keeps people excited and keeps people engaged.
So I would extend the talent conversation and everything we've been saying to now add in the element on top of geo of machine learning, or as what we were talking about in our previous pod with computer vision models. Also been a big, almost majority of this has all occurred out right in the open source. Once again, a dearth of talent that can handle this. I look at something like Raster Foundry, and I'm curious. This may be provocative. I'm curious. Do you guys think do you think it's early? You're talking about not as many people contributing or not as getting as much feedback yet. You know, in our view, it's still, you know, we talk about all these technologies just incessantly. But, you know, when we're going out and training people, there's still like a lot of just really just early days of just introducing people to the tools, getting their feedback, just even figuring out like what they could do with it in their day to day, if anything. And so when you translate that to how does this impact what we're doing on an open source project, there just maybe not that many people right now that either have the resources, the time, or the flexibility in wherever they're currently sitting to say, like, not only am I going to use this, but I'm going to start giving feedback. They may be much more in receivership mode as opposed to take any standard geospatial problem where people have been grappling with it maybe for 15 years, and now you've cracked a code and they can immediately jump in. Mm-hmm. Is that maybe a fair interpretation?
Does it feel like early days to you, Rob?
I think that's part of it. You know, just the sort of market of people to use these open source tools is maybe small. I think in Raster Foundry's case, it's a little bit more about like, you know, there's open source tooling and open source libraries that people can reach for when they want to accomplish a task that are scoped and well defined. And then there's like sort of applications like QGIS, right? So it's definitely early days for like a cloud platform, QGIS, for managing imagery and applying machine learning and doing annotations, all that stuff. so there's much less of a community to be to latch on to like an application, open source application like that. But also I find that the most successful open source projects are the ones that are super scoped and say, okay, this is a foundational piece that you're going to want to use. GeoCharles was like, you want to use raster data at scale or in Scala. Even raster vision is just like, you want to take geospatial imagery and put it through a machine learning pipeline. They're more sort of like the brick and mortar type, like foundational pieces. So I think that also plays into the sort of lack of contribution. But I think what you're saying is like, yeah, the market, sort of the open source market of people that are like going out and searching for these types of solutions is really small, and I think it'll grow over time. But it is early days. Yeah.
One of the great ironies of our work is that we open source almost all of our machine learning work, and yet almost every one of our projects is under NDA. We're not allowed to talk about. So people hire the open source people to build proprietary stuff. That's our business to a great degree. And I think that is a sign that it is still early days, that people think it's novel enough to matter that it's proprietary. And one of the things that we've talked about is like, if something is really core to your business, like it's your true competitive advantage. In our case, I think it's talent. The people that we get together to work on projects is hard to aggregate elsewhere, and so people hire us. That's our competitive advantage. And so the open source work, the blog writing, all that is just an advertisement of our talent. Like you see those things, you're like, oh man, those are pretty sharp people. Everything else is not essential to our competitive advantage, and therefore it's fine strategically to make it open source, because it's someone else's strategic advantage, maybe someone we're competing against, and now we're commoditizing that thing. And so we see ourselves as making it easier, or commoditizing this research of deep learning and distributed processing. Our customers, for the most part, don't see it as a commodity at all. That's why they're hiring us to help them implement it. Once those capabilities start to come in-house, where it's sort of like, I liken it to mobile phone developers. Like in the early 2000s and mid 2000s, late 2000s, if you could build an iPhone app when the first iPhone came out, you were a hot commodity. Like that was something to drop everything, learn how to build an iPhone app, because you could, double your salary overnight. That's happening to a degree right now with machine learning, but then there's people like Fast AI that will teach you how to become an ML engineer for free online and give you all the tools to do it. That's becoming commoditized. Our business will be at its best. We'll sort of be at our peak when it is considered a commodity, and people just want to build applications around that commodity. And so we're going to benefit from a long tail of the adoption of machine learning. I think a lot of companies that position themselves as having some magic ability to use machine learning, they're going to struggle when people realize like, oh, this is actually more approachable than I initially thought. So yeah, I think we're going to have a good time over the next decade as people start to treat it like a mobile app development or a web app development, which if you think about, Robert Cheatham, the founder of Azavea, founded Azavea to build web applications in 2001. And so, the dot-com bubble had probably just about burst at that point. It's probably like the trough of where people thought web development does not have a future. That's when he started the company. The guy sees the long game, and that trickles down through the company. So when we see a new technology, we get excited about it, not because we see a short-term opportunity to build a bunch of wealth, by building something and then reselling it, but because we see what our business is going to look like in the mundane day-to-day building applications, which people are always going to need new custom applications. We're going to see what that looks like in the future.
So I want to close by going back to something that Joe astutely said, which is when he was first looking at open source models right after he joined Azavea, right? He said there was no playbook, right? So you guys are on the spot. All right, we could do this like a debate where you have 30 seconds, right? We won't do that, right? We'll keep it civil.
Clearly, we're not good at 30-second spots.
But as if you had to summarize some of your lessons learned from working at an open source software company, and maintaining projects yourselves, either directly or working with customers on that, making sure they get the most value out of it. What are some of like your top 3 lessons learned? Rob, you go first.
Build things that are scoped and foundational, and open source those. Things that you can use community input to further, and then also prove talent and capabilities through and attract talent. Also be a good maintainer, like be responsive, be on Gitter, respond to issues, cultivate the community, because it might be kind of annoying at the point to have to like respond to a lot, but that will come back in spades later on. And 3, I think let's end with those 2.
You'll cede your time on the floor to Mr.
Yeah.
Morrison. Mr. Morrison, you have the floor, starting with 30 seconds now.
30 seconds. You might actually have to start a timer for me.
Give me a second. All right, go.
I'm not going to like talk fast. That's
All
not
right.
even in.
30 seconds now.
Okay. I would say the number one lesson that I have learned from working on this is not to get enamored with, or not to fall in love with the technology, but to fall in love with your customers and their problems, and then the technology will follow. That's number one. People that get obsessed with like the technology itself, they're at a disadvantage. And then number 2 is, I think, playing off of what Rob said, if you're gonna do open source, use it to your advantage. And that means attracting customers that are great customers and that care and are willing to learn, and using that open source as an opportunity to educate them rather than as just a marketing device. So those would be my 2 things.
That's good. And I mean, if you were only off by 15 seconds, so that's pretty darn good.
Wow.
Yeah.
45 seconds.
good.
That's the fastest
Yes.
I've ever spoken in my entire life.
Well, guys, this has been great. I really appreciate your time. The team and I do. And for all those of you that are listening, we'll make sure to put out some links to Azavea's site, as well as some of the other companies that we mentioned in today's discussion. So thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
And then make sure to tune in next week, where the JV squad, yours truly, will be stepping off the field, and the varsity team will be coming in. Story of my life, as Nick Weir will be leading the squad for the final and third part of this podcast series with Joe and Rob. Until then, take care.